A function is a block of code which runs whenever it's called. In Python functions, you can pass parameters and arguments. There are times when you're working on a complex project which involves hundreds of lines of code, and you want to summarize these codes in such a way that you don't always have to repeat the same code again and again. What you do in such cases is you summarize them into a function. As you can see, a block of code can be performing a specific task. In this case, for example, to create an account, for example, you're creating a bank account, you can write a block of code as a function just to create the account. In a similar way, there can be other blocks of code to withdraw money from that bank account, and there can also block of code that works as a savings calculator. So instead of writing multiple lines of code, all you need to do is just write a function to create an account which contains lines of code, another function to withdraw money from your bank account, which also involves lines of code, and another function that calculates your savings, which also involves lines of codes. In today's video, we'll be exploring Python functions and multiple use cases. Stick around. And here again, we have our Jupyter notebook where we've created a blank project called Python functions. Now, in writing a function in Python, the basic syntax, you have to use a define function. Now, def or define is a built-in function in Python that you use to declare a function, okay? So let's call this my function, and then you move on with a parenthesis, okay? Now, when you define a function, this is the first line, okay, to define a function. The next line, now you have to watch out for your indentation. The next line or the next lines that follow define the blocks of code that should run within that function. Now, in this function, let's just write a simple block of code, which is a print function, a simple block of code, and there you have it. You've written your block of code, okay? So there you have defined the first function. Now, if you want to call out your function, all you need to do is call out the actual function you've created by the function name, followed by the parentheses, and when you run it, it gives you the block of code which you have run. As a basic in Python functions, we have parameters and arguments, which are used when adding multiple variables into your functions. Now, as you can see, the parameters are those inputs that you feed into your function when you're declaring the function. In this case, we're declaring a function called test_fu, which is text short for test function. So we're defining the parameters, and then you can say print, this is parameter. So there we've defined our parameters. Now, if we want to call this function, as you can see, we have defined our parameters. Here we go. If we want to call out this function, the actual values that we feed here is what we call the arguments, okay? So the arguments are the values you are feeding into the function when you are calling the function to action. In this case, the block of code that is going to run is a print statement, which says this is, and then we have this is whatever is in parameters, okay? So parameters is what goes on here. And then, so when we want to run this function, we'll call it out with the text function, and then we supply an argument. So when we supply an argument, we run it and we get this response. In the same way, you can run multiple arguments within a function. One other concept to understand is that when you declare a function, the function should not be left empty. If you're going to leave a function empty, you're going to have to write in a pass statement. So when you run it, there will be no errors. But if I didn't have this pass statement, as you can see, and I run this function, you will see that there is supposed to be an expected block of code, okay? So the only way you can avoid that is to do a pass statement. Just as we have been mentioning, Python functions can be used to execute blocks of code, and this does not leave out numerical functions. As you can see, we can decide to write a block of code which we call my function, and we are supplying a parameter as x. Now, the block of code here is to return 10 multiplied by whatever the value of x is. So if we are to call these arguments here, we're calling it saying my function, and we are supplying the argument of 2. When we run 2, it's going to say 2 multiplied by 10 and return the value. Here we're going to say 4 multiplied by 10 and it returns the value. Here we'll say 7 multiplied by 10 and it returns the value. When we run this, we get those values printed out. Python functions can also be so flexible that you can also embed a list when you're calling out the function. What I'm saying is that the arguments can actually become a list. In this case, we declare a function, my function, which has records as the parameters. So within this function, we're running a block of code, and here we are saying for x in records. Okay, so whatever x is, print the value of x in a sentence and say it's a student. Okay, now what is x? We are saying x for x in records. Okay, now we have another list we have defined here, and we call the list students. Okay, so all we are going to do here now is to, let me just add all this in the same. So here we're going to define call out this function, which is my function, and then the argument we are going to pass here will be students. Students is actually this list here we have declared. Okay, so when we run this students, okay, now you should understand that the arguments and the parameters are very similar. So they are, in fact, they do basically, they are interwoven, they do basically the same thing. The only difference is that the parameters is what you declare when you are calling it, when you are, I mean, is what you embed when you are declaring the variable, the function, and the argument is when you're calling the function. So the student here is a list, and what we are saying here is for x in records, records is what is going to be here. So it's more like saying for x in students, print whatever is here. So it's supposed to print David is a student, Samuel is a student, Jenny is a student. There we go. Now here we have declared another function which we call test function, which has a parameter. And here we are saying that when you call out test function and you supply America as the argument, it's going to print out this is parameter. And here, parameter here is what we have as the arguments here as America. So it's going to print out this is America. Okay, so you run it, you see, it prints that out. But what if we wanted to send in more than one argument? What do we do? That's what we call arbitrary parameters. Okay, so currently this is not an arbitrary parameter, but to make it an arbitrary parameter, you add the star before the parameter that you're declaring. And if that is the case, it simply means you can actually have more than one arguments that you're embedding into the function. And if that is the case, it means when you're printing out the statement here, you actually have to supply which of the index you want to print out. So in this case, this is 2 is China, 1 is Dubai, just take out the space, and 0 is America. Similar to regular arguments, we can also define keyword arguments. Now, in keyword arguments, you can actually send arguments with the key equals to the value syntax. And the way the arguments are ordered in this case actually does not matter. Let us define simple keyword arguments here. As you can see in the parameters, we've got 3 parameters here: parameter par0, par1, and par2. And when we are declaring, or rather when we are calling out the function, as you can see, we call out the parameters by their keyword names: PAR2 America, PAR1 Dubai, PAR1 China. So, but when we are running the block of code, we print out this is PAR1. As you can see, when we print it out, it gives us Dubai because PAR1 here is Dubai. Okay, and in like mind, we want to do PAR0. PAR0 here is China. So it's going to print out this is China. Now, as you can see, it does not follow the ordering of the parameters here, because this is 0, 1, 2, but here is 2, 1, 0. So all that does not really matter. Similarly, we can run this as a keyword arbitrary argument. And in this case, we don't need to use PAR 0, 1, and 2. We can just use it in this format. Now, the difference between the keyword arbitrary, this should be arbitrary, the keyword arbitrary arguments and the regular arbitrary argument is, in the regular arbitrary argument, we're using 1 star, but in the keyword arbitrary argument, we're requested to use 2 stars. And in this case, you would notice that here, this will require one of the keywords to be specified in square brackets. So let's assume I wanted to call out the second one. I'm going to have to go here, part 2. And you run it, it gives you, this is America. If you go with the first one, it gives you, this is Dubai. You go with this one, it gives you, this is China. Now, if you take out one of these stars and you run it, you see it gives you an error, which I was telling you about. So you can see it got an unexpected argument for part 2, because this is not a keyword argument. So you have to add in the second star to run that. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. And until the next video, where we'll continue our discussions on Python functions, I'll see you then.